This episode of the Briar Patch is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Robert Picardo, the emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
This is the 24th century. We've grown out of our infancy. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want. Material needs no longer exist. The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. Enjoy.
Today, streaming to you from the Briar Patch, we would like to talk about the Borg and how there is individualism versus collectivism in their stories. There is an obvious difference between the dystopian and utopian totalitarianism that is shown with the Borg, and we would like to discuss this further.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most people would say the Borg are dystopian for sure, but there's an interesting utopian element to, like, maybe how they started or what they were trying to be at some point or what they could be if they changed a few things. And I think a lot of times people talk about the Borg as if it's all about technology, whereas I think it's much more interesting to look at this idea of collectivism. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they were definitely given technology as their basis on the shows, but that's not all they were about, or even what they were meant to be about, because they were really an in-depth look at communism and how it could go totally haywire very quickly.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's how I've always seen them. But I hear that maybe in the creating of them, or at least in a lot of people's minds, it was more about this fear of technology and so on. And I found that interesting because to me, the technology is just a small part of them. But to me, collectivism is like really what they're about.
Yeah, I think the times in which they were written, a lot of movies at the times were coming out and stuff that were based on how technology could go haywire. And I think that's what informs a lot of people as to why they believe technology was a main factor in this. I just don't think it was either. I think it was just used as something easily recognizable, people feared, and it made them a little more scary. But I agree with you. I think the communism or the Marxist views were what really drove the creation of the race and the Borg Queen in general. And I think that maybe Marxism wasn't necessarily considered a bad thing by the Star Trek writers, and definitely not by Gene Roddenberry, but the way in which communism went about trying to emulate those ideas were definitely a negative.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what I think we need to talk about today is kind of this idea of means versus ends. Borg assimilate people. So they're forcing this on people. And also there's this idea, I mean, they are based on basically a unity. They all share a collective consciousness, right? So they represent unity. And a lot of Marxists, a lot of communist leaders, basically all of them, believed strongly in this idea of unity, of achieving a time of sort of the enlightenment of the people, and they're all being united around one thing, especially because if you're going to have something like planning, everyone needs to agree to the plan, and everyone needs to be united in this idea of communism in order to bring it about. But how do you get there? If you force that on people, a lot of people agree when they study this that it's forcing this on people that kind of led to it becoming more totalitarian and, not working out as this utopian thing that they wanted.
Right. Well, we saw how the Soviet Union ended up going and taking over the Soviet bloc, all the countries to its west, to force this idea upon them. And also it had military strategy involved with fighting the West. But they did so, and a lot of those countries didn't want to be Soviets. They didn't want to be communist, but they were forced into it, and which caused great rebellions, which we see in episodes like Unimatrix Zero, that's kind of the story they're telling, is that by taking over people and forcing them into this, even though they seem to believe, when given the chance to express their own opinions in Unimatrix Zero, they don't believe in what the Borg is doing and how the collective is run.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the sort of international scale version, but there's also within a country. So the story of the Soviet Union itself, of Russia and the beginnings of the Soviet Union, is a perfect example of this. Because you had Lenin rise to power, and he did actually, sometimes people will call it a coup, but he did actually have a lot of popular support. He sort of came to power at a time when people were sick of World War I, and the slogan of the Bolsheviks was land, food, and peace, right? So people were starving, people didn't like World War I. Anyways, so they came to power. And he promised them land as well, as I mentioned. So people were expecting to be given something back, to not be as poor, to not be the peasants that they were anymore. So they believed in him to some extent. But as he tried to implement communism, there were a lot of failures. There was a lot of trouble. He tried to get rid of money right away. But he eventually rolled it back. So although he was quite bad in some ways, he's certainly less bad than Stalin, who came later. But Stalin came from the same party, the same beliefs, and they had this idea, these beliefs in this utopian future. And I could talk all day about this, by the way, so don't let me. But let me just wrap this up for the moment, and we can come back to some of this. But so the Bolsheviks all believed in this utopian vision, and they were all working towards it in the 1920s after Lenin had rolled it back with what he called the new economic policy, which allowed markets back in. Then they still wanted to reach this vision, so they started moving towards it again during the mid-20s, and this is when Stalin was rising to power. And basically what happened was there was an argument about whether to force people to collectivize. And so this was kind of like assimilation, forcing people into this new utopian future, forcing them to join the commune, forcing them to become part of this communist society where there was no more private ownership. And at the same time, he was doing it within the party, basically not allowing any views besides the party line to be acceptable. And so it was this kind of forcing that kind of went hand in hand with Stalin both rising to power and taking control and being essentially the Borg queen. Stalin was the Borg queen.
Right, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I mean, like you said, Lenin wasn't the perfect leader. I mean, there's no perfect leaders anyway, but he definitely wasn't as bad as Stalin was. And Stalin took it to a whole new level, which was then emulated by other leaders across the world, even if they weren't communist. For instance, Hitler took power in similar fashion by more using scapegoats than Stalin did. But Stalin had plenty of things to point at that were wrong in Russia at the time anyway, so he didn't need to scapegoat so many outside people. He scapegoated his own people, or people that were considered outsiders.
Right. I mean, the kulaks, the
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, they were called kulaks. The rich peasants were kind of Stalin's scapegoats.
Right. Looking at the middle class, basically, which is often blamed for a lot of things, or is told that it's being screwed by other people. One or the other usually happens. Hitler told the middle class they were being screwed by foreigners, basically. But that's neither here nor there because that's not.
Yeah, well, there were definitely some similarities in those things that you point out. A lot of the details were different, but they both did use scapegoats. I mean, for the communists, they truly believed that the wealthy, that landowners and business owners, rich people were the enemy. But you could have a non-violent way of doing it where you say you're not going to be able to be rich anymore and keep accumulating wealth, but we're not going to hurt you in any way. We're going to embrace you in this society. Or you can have a violent way where you say the really bad ones will just kill you. The less bad ones will take all of your stuff and lock you up and so on until you only embrace the people without any property.
Correct. And even that they didn't do in the proper way anyway, because even embracing the so-called working class, they didn't necessarily give them everything they deserved in return for everything they had done. So
no, definitely not.
You had a very corrupt system there.
Like freedom, for example. They didn't get any of that.
No, none. Zero. But so let's I guess we should talk, since we've been talking about how Stalin did it, we should talk how we believe it was done, because the Borg don't really give a full explanation as to how they're created, how the Borg Queen comes to power and why she alone gets to think on her own.
Well, or does she? So it's interesting because it's possible, one might say, that in a sense, the Borg Queen is like the physical representation of and the speaker for the Borg, which is actually a collective. And even when she seems to be making decisions, she's making decisions for the Borg collective, coming out of what the Borg collective wants and weighing all of the pros and cons and the things that the Borg collective cares about as a whole, which is, and this is why I think it's such a great connection to Stalin, what Stalin said he was doing when he was forcing everyone to follow the party line and he was giving the party line. He was again saying, I'm just speaking for the party. This is what the party, and he came to power as a moderate, and he was basically presenting what the, in the main, exactly what the Bolsheviks had been talking about. And he basically was presenting the party line. But then, of course, he was in a power to also control everything. And so that's why it's such a perfect metaphor, or, they are basically identical, this idea of the Borg Queen and Stalin, who, in a sense, you can look at it and you can say, are they controlling everything, or are they the manifestation of something that is actually a collective?
Yeah, I guess. I think the part where they
most people wouldn't think Stalin was not trying to control things, of course.
No, absolutely. And I think the part where they tell you, where they really show to me anyway, my personal opinion, that she's thinking for herself is she claims, or the claim is that she's doing it along party lines, right? Along the collective lines. But when she starts blowing up ships because one voice is silenced, she's deciding that at the moment. There's no vote. There's no thought. Now, it might be informed. It might be informed by the group, but she's deciding.
And you don't know how fast they could vote, do you? Since they all kind of are sharing one mind, maybe they could make that vote all in, a millisecond.
They could. I don't see it going that way. That's not the way it's presented in the show anyway.
Yeah.
It's more she's just, he's silenced. I'll wait. I'll tell you that I'm going to do it, and then I blow up the ship.
Yeah, and that's, in a way, that was what proved to the world that Stalin wasn't really, and proved to the Bolsheviks within the party that Stalin wasn't really representing the party line, is when he started killing off first party leaders and also continuing what to be fair, Lenin started in terms of executing people, regular citizens for not doing what he wanted them to do to some extent. And Stalin did that, of course, much worse, and also didn't give people what they needed, starved the people in order to build up the military or whatever. But it was things like mass numbers of people dying that indicated to real believers in socialism that Stalin maybe wasn't really representing the party line. And that's exactly what you see with the Queen, is when she starts doing that, then people say, well, actually, maybe she's not really a representative of the Borg. Maybe she's controlling the Borg in a more selfish way.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the way they meant to present her, was that she was just controlling basically an army for herself. And everyone had to fall in line, or everyone involved with that individual was going to die. Yeah,
basically, I think that's right. Because, that's exactly what happens when she finds one individual Borg on a ship. That one Borg is thinking for themselves, and so she takes out the whole ship. And that's, again, in communism, one person thinks their own way, and them and all of their friends and family and everyone in their circle, their sphere, gets taken out. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but it does, contaminate your family and friends. And they may, under someone like Stalin, they may actually be killed or put in prison or gulag or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason is, if other ships see this, they don't want to be blown up. So the collective would weed out the people who are becoming silent before she has a chance to blow up the ship. It's just interesting she doesn't even give them a chance at first. But that's the scare tactics used under the communist regimes.
Exactly, terror.
Right. It just fear people into giving up their own family members. And we'll spare you. We'll just put you in prison, not kill you.
Right. Yeah, scary stuff. But yeah, you're making my points for me. But it is interesting on the idea of the utopian possibilities within, and we'll talk about the possible beginnings. As we said, there's no canon on this, so we can talk about the ideas of the Borg beginnings. But just before that, I want to briefly mention that 7 says a couple of times. 7 of 9 says things like she wasn't used to authoritarian or All right. Well, in Scientific Method in Voyager, season 4, Seven says that she's not used to the hierarchy or authority, the way that Voyager is run, a hierarchy, basically. Because in the Collective, she didn't have to ask her superior officer or anything. She could just essentially do what she needed to do. She took on a task and did it without having to ask permission. That was the words that she used. I never had to ask permission. And of course, you also have quotes from the Borg Queen, who's of course going to sell it as utopian, and talking about you lack harmony and so on, and this idea of perfection and all of that. But that could be just propaganda. But when Seven says this, and there's a couple of quotes like this, she makes it sound as if it was a little bit more equal, a little bit less hierarchical in the Collective than it is even on Voyager, which you don't think of as being super authoritarian. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, it comes down to, is it worth giving up all your freedom of thought just to not have to answer to somebody? Right. Really, you're still answering to an authority. You just don't realize it because that authority has dictated how you're going to act.
Right, and the authority is the Collective.
Right, and they've decided your task is to go to engineering and fix the warp coils. That's great. You don't have to ask somebody. You've just been told.
Right. Right. You're just basically forced to without even taking the time to go and hear why.
Right. And to think, is that really what needs to be done? Is that the important thing now? Now, they do show that the Borg are super efficient at fixing things in war and other things, but is that worth the loss of freedom and rights?
Right. And it is exactly like in communism. I mean, if you really care about this vision and the idea of what the communist system that you're in is supposed to be doing, if you really care what the Borg Collective is trying to achieve by going out and assimilating people and seeking perfection, if you really cared about all of that, then you might be quite happy to go along with this stuff. Maybe. That's at least, one argument. But if you don't care about it, then most certainly it's going to feel like tyranny, even though you don't have to answer to a specific superior, which, to be fair, under real world communism, you still essentially had a lot of hierarchical things set up. But even if you kind of achieved this more communal, more lateral, less hierarchical system, if it was like the Borg, it may not be hierarchical, but everyone is submitting, as you say, to authority, but that authority is the Collective, but it doesn't mean that you're any less submitting to an authority.
Absolutely. They also show, this episode's more about the Borg, but they put that up against the Federation, who's also very socialist. Let's not forget that everyone has what they need to survive. So everyone's being given what they need by the quote unquote government, which is democratically chosen. So you still have your freedom of choice within the Federation and their socialism. They still have their freedom of choice. However, they are a socialist movement within the Federation that seems, at least in Star Trek, to work. Because it's not
a socialist movement? In the Federation itself.
Correct. That it's a socialist ideal when it comes to how they ration their supplies or whatever.
Yeah, you could say it's a socialist system, but socialism only as defined in the kind of modern casual usage that a lot of people use. You have to be careful with the word socialism because originally it meant the system that would then lead the state to dissolve away and give you communism, and was essentially a planned society, quite hierarchical, where you work and you get paid for the exact amount that you work. And money could eventually dissolve away within that system, and the state could dissolve away within that system to bring you true communism. But socialism itself was like a state socialism. So anyways, a lot of people still think of it that way, so you have to be a little careful with that word, that's all.
But that's why I use the term socialist democracy, because that's what it is. And that's different than your communist socialist.
Well, maybe, but Lenin's group, the Bolsheviks meant actually the majority, and the Mensheviks meant the minority, but those were the majority and the minority, and actually those are flipped because the Bolsheviks were in the minority. But anyway, of a party, and that party was the Socialist Democratic Party of Russia. Yeah, so they all saw themselves as democratic socialists as well.
I understand that, but that's not how the term is used at all today. And anyone listening is not going to think of the Bolsheviks as the Socialist Democrats, especially if they're in the United States and just election. Which that came up quite a bit with Bernie Sanders, but whether he was telling the truth or not is another story. But that's for each person to decide. But that's my point is that system where you still elect leaders, but your social programs, welfare and whatnot, those have actually gone away because you don't need them anymore. But it's because that basically that welfare program was expanded to everyone. And then it gave you the time to decide what you want to do with your life. Do you want to be a Starfleet member? Do you want to play jazz all the time? Whatever, those things. But it's held in check by the ability to vote for people, opposed to in the Lenin and the Stalin or in the Borg scenario where there's a queen and that's the end of the story.
Which is a one-party state. Yeah, so as long as you have multiple parties and you have... that's the thing, is if you lean too much towards even the way that you describe it, socialist democracy, democratic socialism, whatever, the way that you describe it, if you lean very far in that direction, though, you would be essentially, what would your two parties be? Because one party would be, I'm going to make sure that we have this system that we love, and the other party would be, I also love this system, but I want to do it slightly differently, or what? Because, to have a competing two parties, usually they have different ideologies. But when people really care about this ideology and they want to push it very far, then you have to wonder what is the other party going to be? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I understand. I just think the way they present it, because they don't give you their political views, the way Star Trek presents it is, that is what it is. The economics of that is all parties agree, whether there's 1, 2, or 10. Most people would agree that, or would argue that more parties is better than just 2 anyway.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the problems we have, is that there's so few parties in America right now that are actually viable. There's tons of extra parties.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other debate.
But it leads you back to both parties kind of working for the same thing anyway, claiming slight differences. But what you end up having is you have them arguing over other things when it comes to which party you agree with. Maybe not necessarily the economics within the society, but you have them, their foreign, what would we call foreign policy, and those things would become much more important. The idea of exploration would become more important. How do we go about it? Where do we go about it? Who do we align with? Who do we not align with? Stuff like that. You might have groups within the Federation. Now they don't show it, but you might have groups that want to become friends with the Borg, even though the Borg are not interested in becoming friends with anybody.
Right. Absolutely. No, that's a very good point, and I totally take your point there. I think, as we talked about in our Utopian episode, I think the big thing that makes that all possible, though, is the economics of it, in the sense of being able to be wealthy enough and choosing to, but at some point when you're so wealthy, you can't even stop it, making sure that everyone has the basic necessities and beyond the basic necessities. Once that is achieved, then I think a lot of this becomes a lot easier, right?
Oh, absolutely. And we're nowhere near that. But yeah, I absolutely agree that it comes down to the fact that it's really hard not to give everyone what they need when it's as easy as it is in Star Trek, in their universe. How do you withhold that from people just to keep an economy going? I mean, even if there was a party that believed that, do you think anyone would ever get a vote when it's obvious that we can turn air into food? I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of shuts those people up and just kind of essentially just happens on its own, basically, I think.
Right. And we would need to create replicators for that, which we don't have yet. But that's getting off on a tangent from the Borg anyway. I just find it interesting that they give you 2 versions of this kind of everyone gets what they need, one that's good and one that's terrible.
Right.
And they don't give us enough background.
Because everyone does get what they need in the Borg, assuming that what they need is whatever they need while they're within this Borg collective, which is they do get fed and they have their weapons and stuff, but they don't have, any freedom or individuality, of course.
Right. As far as strict survival, the Borg do a great job of it. They all have their regeneration chambers. None of them are sitting waiting to regenerate and dying off or anything. So in that strict sense, they do a phenomenal job. Again, they're extremely efficient.
Right.
The Borg are extremely efficient at just about everything they do, except thinking.
Yeah.
Because they're not allowed to think at all.
Right. And not individually, but collectively they think very well. I mean, when they get fired on by an enemy and the enemy hurts them, they do some very quick thinking on how to adapt, right?
Correct. They also, interestingly enough, as a group, decide who to attack and who not to attack. If they don't want to assimilate you, They just completely ignore you until you attack them.
Right. And is that the Queen making the decision or the collective? Or maybe she lets the collective make that decision except when she wants to intervene? We're not sure, I guess.
Yeah, I would think the third option. I would think that she does have a plan. She just shows too much intelligence in the times that we do see her to have no plan. And that if they come across someone they want to assimilate, let's say, but she finds them to be too much of a risk or not worth the technology, that she would intervene and change the collective's thought, and that it wouldn't happen. They would ignore them again.
Yeah, I think that probably makes the most sense. And along those lines, what about the origin of the Borg? Do you have any thoughts on that? I saw quite a long time ago episode, but I heard it again recently. It was a To the Journey podcast, and they talked about the Borg origins. And I think it was number 186. And they also referenced in an earlier episode, even from before that, I could look it up. I think it was 97 or something. And they, in both episodes, in the first one, in the earlier one, 97, I think, they mentioned several books that talk about the Borg Queen's origins, and through that, the Borg's origins. And then in the later episode, again, I think it was 186, in that episode, they decided to come up with their own version of the origins of the Borg, because there is no, like we said, there's nothing in canon that actually explains it. So yeah, number 97 and number 186 of To the Journey. They're both really good episodes. And anyway, since there isn't a canon description of the Borg origins, it's very fun to think about. And again, it sounds to me, whatever version you come up with has some metaphorical similarities to Stalin coming to power, but some of the specific ones sound almost identical. and part of that is the Austrian idea, or even before the Austrians and besides the Austrians, but they talk about it a lot. The quote, worst rise to the top argument, where basically the person who's kind of the most power hungry and the most willing to use violence tends to rise to the top of societies and become the leader, like Stalin did, when you have a society that is set out in a certain way that certainly socialism, communism fits, but maybe also, say, fascism could fit, and which is in some ways similar in terms of the structure of not the culture, but the structure of the economic system and political system have certain similarities. Of course, not entirely, and you can get into a big, long debate about how they're opposites in some sense, but in some ways, when the government having a lot of control over the means of production and over everything, make them similar. And it's that basic element that allows the worst to rise to the top, like a Stalin to take over. And so you could argue that the Borg Queen, similarly, once you had the Borg Collective, basically someone wanted to take advantage of that. And this is kind of what they talk about in their Borg origin story in To the Journey, that once you have this kind of system in place, then you have someone who, like the Borg Queen, who basically maybe was doing some technological work for them, creating the incubus or succubus or whatever that's called, the Borg Vinculum, that's it, Vinculum. But so she might have created some technology which helped them filter out stuff that they don't care about so that their collective mind could focus on stuff they do care about, and then gave herself a little back door to it, and it allowed her to take over the whole collective when she wanted to, that kind of thing. Right.
I mean, the story makes sense, but where'd the original technology come from that they were even part, humanoid and part machine? I'd love to hear that story from Star Trek one day, because obviously they must have created them with some kind of link together originally, right? And then
they have their own version of that in the To the Journey episode. They explain, and they also in the earlier episode it does get written up in a couple of books, so they mention that in number 97. But in their version, the Trek FM version, 186. They come up with their own version of why they linked together. 6 scientists needed to solve the problem that was going to destroy their planet, a sort of global warming or whatever kind of thing. And so they ended up linking their minds to help them, because they all had different theories, to bring all of their theories together and have a more powerful mind. Once they did the link, it was still not violent and not terrible for quite a while, but it kind of grew into this bigger system. And then eventually they decided to use it to actually force an assimilation on someone. And it was that person who because they needed her so badly to help with this technological stuff and all of that. And she had the right mind for it and so on and so forth. So they ended up forcing her, assimilating her. And then she kind of maybe got back at them in a sense and used her power within it and her technology that she created within it to give herself the back door and become the queen.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes sense. I'd still like to see Star Trek's version, but that actually makes perfect sense within the confines of the society, how it would likely come to be. I don't know. It's an interesting question, and it would definitely inform why they're the way they are now better if we had an actual backstory of them. But does it really matter for the stories they're trying to tell anyway? I guess not. It would just help our podcast a lot.
Yeah. But it's also fun to speculate and to sort of discuss the different versions. So I like that version, but we could also at some point maybe discuss some of the book versions and how they differ and what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. The Borg's going to come up a lot in this podcast to begin with. Just because they're such a good case study in communism and a good case study in enforcing ideals in general, just colonialism as it were, but in a little bit different way. You can see that by how they go into races, take them over, and then leave. And what's interesting is they don't always take over a full race, because we see that they've attacked people from the Federation then ran into the Enterprise and did nothing. They just ignored them until they were attacked. So it's not even like they set out to just annihilate an entire race or society. They pick and choose their targets pretty well. Easy planets to take over.
Well, they definitely pick and choose, but sometimes it's a bit confusing because they do kind of get quite focused on the humans, don't they?
Yeah, but I think that's because the humans got quite focused on them. And also, this is another place where I think they show us that the Borg Queen has a mind of her own, because she becomes obsessed with the idea of getting Locutus. Mm. And then even when she can't do that, in the movies we see she gets Data and turns him more human, which I found very interesting that she could work it the other way around. Mm. All right, so the Borg uses the central plexus to disseminate its information around to everyone. Now, do you think that was a stand-in maybe for the internet?
I don't know. I mean, I think that if it's the one that kind of filters what's important and what's not important and brings it together and then spreads it around the entire collective, the vinculum, then it sort of seems to me to represent kind of the propaganda coming from the state, from the communist state or whatever. But the link between the people could be seen as the internet, and especially if you're focusing more on the technology rather than the social system, then that would certainly seem to represent the internet.
I think so. And I think, again, if we look at the time frame of which these stories were written, people were very afraid of the internet being used to censor thoughts, opposed to, at the time when the internet first came out, it was absolutely 100% free information, which led to some really bad information getting out at first.
We're seeing that again today for sure with fake news, aren't we?
Correct. And we're seeing this a lot where stories are being put out without, the news cycle used to be 24-hour minimum. Something would come out, it would be on the news, and you'd hear about it for a day. And then maybe you'd hear about it again, but at least a day before new news came out. Now news cycles become 25 minutes. And then and news companies, and this isn't just the internet, but they're trying to beat the internet is what becomes a problem is they're releasing information before they've actually made sure that it's correct. Even if they're not intending to give out fake news. Yeah. Sometimes they're giving out very bad information because they know they can update it 25 minutes later on the internet. Problem is...
And they're pressured to get out the news fast.
Yeah, because they need clicks, because clicks equal money. So I think at the beginning of this, when this was airing, when the Borg was first created, that a lot of this was a fear of the internet being used to disseminate bad information, whether it be on purpose or not. I think originally people thought the internet was going to give out bad information on purpose, that people were going to be able to get information out quickly, faster than...
I wonder why people would...
Go ahead.
I wonder why people would think that if they knew that it was free access and everyone could use it. Who were they expecting to take it over and spread bad information?
I don't necessarily know if they think people were going to take it over, but if it was completely free access, which it is at the moment anyway, you could put anything you want, and you just have to get people to believe your version of the story.
So maybe some group like white supremacists or communists or whoever would jump on because they have free access to this, and they would spread their propaganda, their ideas, and do that on purpose. And in doing so, tell lies and do whatever they wanted to do. Is that the kind of thing?
I think so. I mean, people just feared the internet at the time. If you watch, that's when, just earlier than that, that's when movies like Tron and stuff were coming out. And the whole thing was people were afraid of the internet. They were afraid of what technology could lead to.
Right. Especially, I mean, I think one of the things that people feared was the idea that it would sort of take over society. And Tron, you could think of it as falling inside the internet, being stuck inside the internet, and that's your whole world or something. And I think there are quite a few, like The Matrix, maybe, things like that, where this would become the new reality and you would not even know what reality is anymore.
Yes, and I don't think they were too far off, were they? I mean, people walk. I work in Manhattan. People walk around with their heads in their phones, crossing major streets, almost getting hit by cars. There are people who care more about how someone views them on the internet than they do how someone views them in real life. People worry about how many friends they have on Facebook and Twitter and how many followers and these things.
Yeah.
Now, has it gone to the point of Tron? Maybe not in some ways, but maybe not.
I think sorry, go ahead.
Maybe not even in the way that the Borg uses it, but we do see that a lot of people will take anything they read on the internet as face value. And it's become a joke among people. Oh, it must be true. It's on the internet. But a lot of people just believe it because they read it on the internet.
Right.
And they do no more further searching. And the sad thing is, even if you try and research a lot of these topics, sometimes you're just researching more bad information.
Yeah. If you, especially, on certain topics, there is a right place and a wrong place to find good information, where it's not just because some newspaper is better, more reliable than another, but there's actually a right place, like a scientific journal. But if you don't know, first of all, what it is, what is the right place, and second of all, maybe even if you did, you couldn't really read it, or you couldn't access it, or you couldn't fully understand the implications or whatever, because it's a specialized topic, then you're just, like you say, going to read a whole bunch of things that are equally possibly false. And you could either count them and add them up, or you could see if any of them seem to have a leaning. But then you have to kind of research each place that you're going to research your topic, and keep going layers and layers deep before you can know whether it's true or not.
Right, and it's hard to ask the average Joe to research for hours and hours on end when X experts say this and X experts say that. So, for instance, one of the studies, one thing that people argue constantly on the internet is vaccines good or bad? Do they cause autism or not? Some people believe it, some people don't, but or global warming. Some people believe it, some people don't. There's a ton of information on both sides. Which ones do you believe? Most scientists agree one way, but that doesn't change the fact that people believe the other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's happening more and more, and that's why some people really say that we need to have a sort of elitist small group of journalists and newspapers and so forth, and kind of not use the internet for that at all. And they wish for those days when that's all you had. But of course, if you have that, if you don't have a very open democratic society and you don't have, say, also an internet to look things up on separately as well, then those things can be abused by the state or by even a few corporations or whatever as well. And then you just get one source of information, and that information can be lying to you.
Right, absolutely. And the central plexus is to tell you that this is being controlled by one group and one group only, right, which makes the matter that much worse. People would argue that you still have that problem today in that corporations have so much money they can fund bad studies. But there's plenty of good information and bad information on the internet. It's just up to you. It's just hard sometimes to decipher those. But it is still better than the central plexus, which I think was just an analogy of the state taking over the internet and deciding what can and can't be on it.
Okay, yeah.
Which at the time, again, was something that was happening. Remember, in the very beginning of the internet, you couldn't sell things on the internet. The government didn't allow it in the United States. Once it did, then you ended up, and here's where part of the fear comes from. Once sales of the internet was allowed, once there was commerce allowed on the internet, you ended up having a bunch of, and it's still the number one reason for use of the internet, you had a lot of pornography sites come up.
Right.
That's what led to the pornography industry booming on the internet, was the ability to sell it.
Mm-hmm.
So
sure, but that's not bad. And, that's not such a, I mean, I don't think that's such a terrible thing, that people can sell things, even if that's what they want to sell, as long as, people are allowed to, I think that freedom is really important, even if you have things that people find distasteful, right?
No, I absolutely agree. That's not...
And essential plexus and vinculum would not allow that, probably, right? It would.
Yes,
it would
correct.
prevent
Central plexus would knock that out. My only point, the pornography thing's a side note. The point is that before that, you had the government saying that you can't sell anything, so there was a lot less things actually on the internet. And then once that blew open, you had that, but you also had eBay and Amazon. None of these things would exist had those regulations not been taken off the internet.
Right, and the government allowing people to, the government not allowing people to sell things at the beginning was showing that the government was willing to take control of this thing. So perhaps people worried that if they were willing to have that type of control, they would be willing to take it over completely.
Correct, absolutely. And really, the internet was designed for military use. So it wasn't initially designed for us to have this podcast going right now. It wasn't designed for you to be able to buy things on eBay. It was designed in one country, but it was really pushed along in the United States anyway, so that if the telephone system was ever hit, that you could still communicate cross-country or across the globe with soldiers and get orders out from the presidency. That's what the real intent was, because people don't realize how a telephone system works. But basically, if you call from one area, it has to go through switchgear, and if you're trying to get to the other side of the country, there's actually a very finite number of systems it can use. So if the number one overall switch room was blown up, let's say in a terrorist attack or by an attack from any military, the problem you would run into was you could no longer call California.
Right. So
they were afraid of the government taking it back for control of their own and only their own.
Right.
And then we wouldn't have what we have today.
Sure. It was partly exactly that, allowing companies to come in and sell things that expanded the internet and gave it, so that people would jump in, so that they would pay people to create new software, to create new capabilities for the internet, some of the more back-end, low-level stuff that even still wasn't created at the beginning. I mean, you didn't, until you had web browsers on every computer, you didn't have a lot of the abilities that we take for granted today and things that came after that. And so a lot of that was done for money. And then a lot of it, other people on another side might argue, and they don't have to be opposed, you can see both are true, that a lot of people did things for free. And that it was the collective, it was the bringing together of the collective to work on similar projects, not one project, but kind of like one project, in order to bring about something that was good for everyone, and they were willing to do it for free. And of course, they had to have a little bit of ability to survive without getting paid or additional free time in order to do that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, though, yes, I agree. I just also believe that without the paid portion, you wouldn't have the amount of people on the internet for it to even be worth the people to make the free stuff
right.
to use. And a lot of things were done for quote-unquote free to us, but like Facebook was invented and it turned into a profit. I mean,
sure.
The advertising on it.
I was thinking more open source kind of stuff and things like that. And some of it is done by people who are getting paid at a company while they're making it, but some of it, like Wikipedia or certain open source things, a lot of the contributions were done at home by people who had free time after work.
Absolutely, but you'd have to drive enough people to the internet initially to make it worth it. So without the original, the internet was really small when it first came out, and basically you could only go on and click links to documents. Without that eventually evolving.
I remember.
Yeah, me too. You still find some of those websites every now and then. It's just a hashtag index.
Oh, I was even thinking even before websites. So you even had, you had IRC kind of channels, and
yes.
you had these text browsers before even regular web browsers came up, and you'd have links on the text browsers to bring you to another document. But it was basically that was one document to another, and that was it.
Yeah, it was terrible.
And
but without this ability to sell things, you wouldn't have the leaps that gave the people that want to do things for free the ability to do them as well.
Right.
All this opened up. We're a little off topic, but the point is the central plexus is what stops all of that from happening. It keeps you stuck just in the text-based browsing, which is what it's doing. It's letting out information. It's not text-based because it's mind to mind, but it's the same concept. It's holding the thoughts to just this document, and then just that document, and then just that document, which is causing the society to really, while it seems very technologically advanced, it's really holding the society back as well. You may see better leaps and bounds if at least individual ships were able to believe what or think for themselves.
I really like that way that you just put it just now, that kind of metaphor, the way that you described the metaphor of the internet and the Borg. And you point out they may look technologically advanced, but they're being held back. And that's also what you saw with, say, the Soviet Union. You know, a lot of people thought they were very technologically advanced, but they were definitely being held back in so many ways by their planning system and by this filtering of information to be exactly only what the party line wanted you to be thinking about.
Oh, absolutely, because the Borg and the Soviet Union both, they had massive jumps in the front end, which is why they were able to get to space before the United States. But they still haven't put a man on the moon for just those same reasons.
Right.
It doesn't work out that way in the long run. Not unless you get to a point where you actually do have unlimited resources.
You need that market, and you need that freedom and that individuality, that flexibility, dynamism, and so forth to be able to really innovate and advance. I mean, of course, you can have some innovation from the military, as we talk about the internet and so forth. But if it doesn't get out to that broader, as we talked about, market and, you know, private individual creativity places, then it doesn't get those contributions, then it won't really continue to advance, and it'll stay stuck in whatever that initial innovation was that the military wanted or the planner wanted.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that was a great segue or topic, but we wanted to talk about some other things. We haven't really talked about individualism, for example, as compared with collectivism, except for like in a couple of sentences just now.
Yeah, so what we see, one of the ways to look at the individualism is to look at the episode with Hugh the Borg. I'm not recalling the name of the episode.
Borg, I think.
Borg, that's right. And how they actually can use him to destroy the collective.
Yeah, or at least Picard thought so. I wonder about that a little bit, but what do you think? Do you think that was possible to insert individualism? It certainly is a great metaphor for what can happen in a communist socialist society where individualism can kind of infect the people and get them to disagree with the system and the planner and stuff and mess up their supposed utopia, right?
Yes, I think the way it's explained in the episode, I absolutely think it would have worked.
Yeah?
Yeah, because they were basically feeding a backfeed loop into a computer system. The Borg are basically presented as a computer system, and they were just going to confuse them.
Right.
The one problem is, again, that central plexus, I guess, could have put an end to it. But if it's programmed properly, you can take down any computer system, right?
Yeah, exactly. They could essentially be hacking the central plexus, and so then the central plexus, presumably being hacked, wouldn't be able to stop it.
Right. So I do think I love the episode itself. I love the way it's presented. I do like that they come to the realization to not destroy what has become their friend within the Borg.
Right.
Although I also wish they would have done it, but I guess, you can't have both.
Well, I guess, you can if he was really willing to and really thought it would work and it would take them down, and then he would have his individuality back if it worked properly enough and he was able to break free because of that, poisoning and stuff. If he was willing to take that risk and do it and it succeeded,
right?
Then maybe you could have both.
Yeah, but I don't think, was it presented in a way where he would be free afterwards, or was it presented in a way that they would just be confused for eternity and unable to move? I mean...
Yeah, I think it was more the latter.
Yeah, so you'd be basically tying his wrist and destroying the race in general, but not because some would die off and some would live, but it was actually, they would all just become useless.
Right. Right, and if that's the outcome, then it's better probably that they didn't, I don't know if it's better or worse, but at least they had the morality that you don't sacrifice one individual in order to achieve even a good that's good for the whole collective. And that's one of the key things about collectivism is this willingness to sacrifice the individual. And Starfleet is not collective in that sense.
Right, absolutely. It's actually what makes the Borg and the Federation completely different from each other.
Yeah.
So the Borg would have no problem killing one person to destroy their enemy, whereas the Federation has a problem with killing an innocent just to get its means.
Right, exactly. That's the means ends aspect of it. This willingness to use whatever means, like we were saying before about Stalin being willing and the Borg being willing to assimilate. this collectivism that's willing to use any means to get their ends ends up destroying that system. And I think the Federation fully understands that and respects the individual life, the individual person, and so forth, which, libertarians argue that's why they believe in individualism so much, because they have that respect for the individual, as well as their rights to property and their rights to freedom and so forth. But you're right, that's a big, big difference between the Federation and the Borg.
Right, even though they both, in theory, supply everyone with everything they need, that's your main difference between the two cultures.
Yeah.
That one is willing to kill anyone to keep its society as is, its culture as is.
And to achieve its ends that it wants.
Right. Whereas the Federation is more willing to embrace other cultures, to add on to its knowledge, not to steal the culture.
Right. The Borg say that they just want to add your individuality to their own, add your, what is the word? We will add your distinctiveness to our own. But they're not just adding it. They're trying to take it, and they'll be happy to take all of it.
Correct. And if your parts don't add up to theirs, it gets wiped out.
Right.
It has to in some way add up to theirs completely and fold in perfectly. Otherwise, it's no good.
Right. And then if you're lucky, they'll leave you alone, and if you're not, they'll just kill you.
Correct.
Yeah. So and that point that we just made from the iBorg episode about individuality getting inserted into the collective is, in a sense, that also comes up in the episode which we've talked about a few times before, Unimatrix Zero, because in a sense, that's what Janeway tried to do, and to some extent achieved, which was to allow the individuality that people had within Unimatrix Zero to be retained when they left Unimatrix Zero. And as it turned out, they retained not just, they retained everything, their memories, their individuality, and so forth, and were able to break free and go their own separate ways. But in a sense, you could imagine them just bringing out some individuality, but still kind of being stuck in the Borg, but in that sense, messing up the Borg system. Or, even the way that it is, they retain it and then they fight against it. And so there you have, like in a communist system, there you have your underground who don't believe in the system and want to break free and want to take the system down.
Right. And originally the way it's presented is that as they come out, they don't remember, which is them. It's basically them being able to hide from the Borg collective in general. But the one thing I didn't like about the way that's told is as soon as they're able to retain the information leaving, they're automatically silenced to the Queen. She can't hear them anymore. Right. So it's very easy to find them. In real underground scenarios, they weren't as easy to find. But the reaction, I guess, you only have so much time to tell a story, so you have to tell it. So
or if we can just take it as truth. That's what happened. But you're right that in a real society, they wouldn't be found out as easily, but there is a metaphor to that idea of being silenced. Like they're silent within the group.
Right. Well, they're dissenting is what they're really trying to prove here. In reality, you had people that were unwilling to even talk to their brothers because they were afraid they'd be found out. Whereas here, they're immediately found out and destroyed. What I do find interesting is she starts blowing up ships, but she doesn't get all of them. She doesn't blow up everyone that was in Unimatrix Zero. And at first, originally, they actually infiltrate Unimatrix Zero with Borgs that, for some reason, while they're in Unimatrix Zero, are still connected to the hive, which I never really understood that, because that area itself was supposed to be disconnected from the hive.
No, Unimatrix Zero is just it's just a telepathic place, right? So they're still they were sleeping. They were in their regeneration chambers when they went into Unimatrix Zero. So they were all initially both connected to the hive and in Unimatrix Zero at the same time, because they were in their regeneration chambers and they were experiencing Unimatrix Zero in a sort of a telepathic virtual world.
I guess. I just wish they would have presented it in a way that the Borg that went in to stop them had individuality, but still wanted to be the Borg. I think that would have been a better story. Because some people are definitely going to be. Not everyone that's a Borg is going to want to separate.
Right.
We saw
that's something we haven't seen. Yeah.
Seven. She has a hard time coming to grips with having freedom again.
Right.
Now they do present the fact that she was actually in Unimatrix Zero before she disassociated with the hive and became part of Voyager. But it would have been nice if they didn't just, that when they stuck the Borg into Unimatrix Zero, they just continued to act exactly how the Borg act. They were very robotic.
That's interesting that you would like to see that. I have a different take on it, because the way that I see it is very much like this real world communism thing. Because so when they're in Unimatrix Zero, they don't really remember being Borg. And obviously as Borg, they don't remember being in Unimatrix Zero. So when they're in Unimatrix Zero, they have the personalities that they had before they were assimilated. And so they want to be individuals, and they hate the Borg and everything when they're in Unimatrix Zero, because they're completely separated from that. They don't remember any of the time that they were the Borg, because that was a collective mind, you got to realize. And so now they're back in an individual mind completely. And they haven't just been cut off and retain the memories the way that it happens when Seven gets disconnected, because that's when you're actually physically getting disconnected and your mind comes back out and retains everything. I don't know. There's a way to explain it. But when you're in Unimatrix Zero, the way I understand it, you just are completely separate. You don't have to go through any process. You're just in a completely mental place, like when you're dreaming. And when you're dreaming, you could be a different person, in a way. So in this, when they're in Unimatrix Zero, they are who they were before they were assimilated. And nobody really wants to be Borg before they're assimilated. But after you've been assimilated, losing those memories of all of those minds that you were connected to, all of those different voices. Seven talks about it a lot. Every other Borg that we see when they get disconnected also talks about it. Like, where are the voices? And they become suddenly very lonely because of that process and that reality, being alive to having been Borg, which they aren't when they're in Unimatrix Zero. So then there's this whole loss, this whole disconnection. And again, this connects to people. You see people when they've been in a communist state. Obviously, the dissenters, when they were dissenting in the state, they were happy to leave. But people who weren't dissenting, who made it part of their lives, who became accustomed to it, when that system ends or they get separated from it, they feel a loss, because there was some kind of utopian aspects to it. There was some unity. There was some connection with other people, and they were used to being told what to do. And now they're not being, now they have to make all these decisions, and they feel the loss as well.
No, I understand that, but I think you just made my original point. the ones that she sends in to stop them, should have been somewhat different than just regular drones at that point.
Ah, okay, I misunderstood. I thought you were saying that the people who were feeling like individuals should have felt like drones.
No. I mean, the drones that go in to attack, and if they kill them in Unimatrix Zero, they die in their pods.
Yeah.
They should have seemed different than just regular drone.
I think that's because of the genetic component, which I always found a little weird, but I accept it. It's what happened. They had a mutant gene that allowed them to experience Unimatrix Zero, whereas the drones that the Queen sent in, I don't think they had that gene. She gave them some other technology that allowed them to enter. And so they entered under her control as drones.
Yeah, I guess. I think I would have liked the story better had they just been extremely loyal.
Right.
Because there are people that are in this society.
Sure.
There are soldiers, there are generals and stuff that just agreed with Stalin. Whether we like it or not, that's just the way it was.
Right.
And they should have been those people.
Yeah. But then they wouldn't have had the gene, maybe. And so they are the same people maybe going in as drones. I don't know.
Yeah, it is what it is. But it's long gone. They've already written the story, so we can't change it. But
we already have that piece of history.
That's my only point. I mean, it served its purpose. It did well. I guess I could be wrong, and maybe they just wanted to be that. Maybe that's what they were trying to tell you, that those people were so loyal that they stayed drones even when they went into Unimatrix Zero. But,
and as I say, I think it might have this, the answer might be to do with this genetic component. Yeah. And that's what makes them different or whatever. And so the very loyal ones don't have that genetic component, or that's the kind of the metaphor is between the genetic component and the loyalty or something. I don't know.
Absolutely could be.
Like you're a mutant communist if you're disloyal. The mutation is the disloyalty or something.
Right. It makes sense.
Okay. Well, do you have any final thoughts?
I mean, my final thoughts on the Borg are, I really like them as a villain in the series. I really think they show the communist thought process very well. I think it doesn't really matter for the viewer whether they see it as a technological or cultural issue. I think both versions tell the story of communism very well. And it's Star Trek, so you're going to get technological components to most races anyway, because that's what drives the storytelling. They're going to use technology as a main vehicle to give their views on culture and whatnot. And that doesn't just mean to make everyone technologically advanced, because we see that the Klingons still like to fight with swords. Their lack of use of technology at some point actually defines their culture and how they are. So the fact that they made the Borg overly technologically advanced doesn't really bother me, and I don't think it takes away from the story if that's all you focus on. I think there's more to it than that, but I think if you focus on just the technology, you can get the whole story of the Borg anyway. So, that is what it is. I think that they show that even with just the technological part or without it, they show that individualism does not work in their society because of the way they have it set up. Their culture is set to strictly be, a community of one mind, thinking one thing and moving one way. And then if that changes at all, that being has to be destroyed, which is the problem with communism that we've seen throughout the history. So I think they did a very good job of explaining that without maybe necessarily calling out an individual, but because they made it a queen, not a king, which I thought was interesting as well, that they made it a queen. And both actresses they picked to play the queen did great jobs in doing so. Yeah. So, I don't know. I really like the Borg as a villain, and I would find it interesting if they ever found a way to make them not as much villains, because they did have that agreement with them in Voyager at one point, but it was really just kind of, we're not worth it, don't bother us kind of agreement more than an alliance. Yeah. And it would be hard to make an alliance because, your group, the Federation, is always fighting them, but who knows what comes in the future of Star Trek.
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
So what are your final thoughts on this episode?
Right. Well, yeah, I think you made some really good points in this episode, and you helped me. I'm surprised at how much you agreed, actually, with me on it as a metaphor for communism. And I do think that if people focus only on the technological aspect, they may miss some of this. I think it really is a great metaphor. Even, for example, the fact that the Borg drones seem kind of sort of so stupid, and that the whole way that the Queen and the Collective have to do their planning together, and the way that this in some of the episodes, like when Janeway makes the alliance with them, can affect the outcome of it. The fact that the drones are kind of stupid and just following orders, and you see that when Picard is assimilated, the way he sort of starts to become quite stupid. I think that's really interesting. I'm not calling people in communist society stupid. I'm talking about the idea of the plan and the collective and how you get everyone to work together is very difficult. And the Austrians called this, Hayek called this the fatal conceit, the idea that you can plan everything. So essentially a lot of these ideas, there's a little hint of them here and there. And, as I say, I could talk about communism and things for just all day long because I've written books about it. But the Borg are really an interesting way of bringing some of these ideas out, as we've talked about today. So, I mean, that's really what I think. And I think that you came up with so many really interesting additional ideas. And I'm kind of surprised that you agreed with me. I wasn't sure if this metaphor was something that was only in my head or that other people, also saw.
I think it's safe to say most people see it as, as a communist regime, the Borg, but who knows? I'm sure they'll tell us in the Babel conference after the episode airs. So
yeah, I hope they do. Well, it's been great talking about how Stalin is the Borg queen, but this isn't the only thing we've been discussing on the network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Even with the animated show, I know it was Gene Roddenberry's wish that the animated show not be considered canon, but so much of what we know about Star Trek comes from the animated show, what Kirk's, name is, and what, to hear Tiberius, I think, for the first time is in the animated show, if I'm not mistaken.
The Orb.
But also, Rom, in the end, obviously kind of has a heart of gold. He's a guy who just wants to take care of people. He really likes people. And that's kind of who Lita is, too. And so they're really kind of kindred spirits.
To the journey!
And Chakotay looks amazing in his fatigues.
He does.
Hands down.
He does.
Everyone likes a man in uniform, yes.
Oh, unless it's a Nazi uniform, then no.
Or a woman in uniform.
Yes.
We're an equal opportunities podcast.
Earl Grey.
So this goes. I chose from Justice.
It's a Wesley moment. It's a Wesley moment.
I knew I was gonna catch flack for that. No, it's not a Wesley moment. I was actually thinking about doing that, but yeah, no.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite conversation of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPad, iPhone, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app and get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 straight from the website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose message to a trek.fm show and select the Briar Patch. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. Well, Guinevere, when you're not calling drones dummies, where can listeners find you on the interwebs and around the Trek FM network?
Yeah, well, you can find me on Facebook, definitely, on the Babel Conference, and you can yell at me for saying that. Honestly, I didn't mean it that way. And you can also find me occasionally on Twitter. My handle is Guinevere42. And how about you, Patrick? Where can people find you?
Well, I can be found on Babel Conference quite often. I'm also on Twitter from time to time. It's Magic Drop 5 on Twitter. It's one word. The 5 is a number. I also pop up here and there around the network, sometimes on the live show of The Edge. I've been on Postcards. I've been on, Earl Grey, Metatrex, and the Warp 5. Sorry. I couldn't remember the one that gave me my start. Warp 5. Look at that. And, but yeah, and you can always find me just hanging around the interwebs and stuff. And, you know, hopefully you listen to me there, here, and everywhere else, because those are some great shows, even if I'm not on them.
Great. Well, if you'd like to help us and all those shows come to you every week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. So please visit patreon.com/TrekFM if you want to do that. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, all available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It does require a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. And we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Briar Patch team from the network, specifically C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek FM, executive producers Matthew Rushing and Ken Tripp, Aaron Harvey, our art director, Richard Marquez, production manager, and the Patreon manager, Brandon Shea Muchala.
And don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and to get your seat on the mission. And check out Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for your desktop and mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/TrekFM. Well, we must be heading back into the Briar Patch now. It takes about a day to get to a place where we can transmit. Till next time, this is Guinevere and Patrick signing out.